Uh, so, sir, thank you for the 45 minutes of, one could say, pretty incisive insights into the India-US relationship. Now, so following up on this, we have a couple of questions. Will not take more than 15 minutes of your time. And they're precisely on India's engagement with a number of countries and the possible role that US can also play in it. So the first question, sir, we wanted to probably, if you could throw some more light on can India and USA work together? Do they have shared objectives in Afghanistan, and can they really work together meaningfully to engage on the Afghan issue? So,
let me take 2 or 3 questions together, because otherwise.
Okay. So the other aspect of the question is on the India-Japan relationship. Now, while Quad or no Quad, the aspect of India, Japan and US coming together has been talked about at some length. So in your opinion, do you see that the economic engagement of India-US relationship, will it be able to strengthen the economic engagement of India-Japan relationship? Does it have potential to grow in the long term beyond the strategic defensive argument that India and Japan have common interests with respect to China? Is the economic aspect of India-Japan relationship also one where you see good potential for the future? So the third question is on the India-Myanmar aspect. You've been India's ambassador to Myanmar, etc., and we see Myanmar opening up. Some say Myanmar is apparently to be China's second port beyond the Gwadar. So is the prospects for India-Myanmar relationship likely to gain momentum in the coming years? And whether it's on the trilateral highway project or India's engagement into Myanmar, do we see some real, one could say, concrete developments in the India-Myanmar relationship in the future as well?
Okay. So let me take up the issue of Afghanistan. Is there a convergence of interest between India and the US as far as the Afghan issue is concerned? Yes, there is a convergence of interest in terms of both India and the United States being very concerned about the possible re-emergence of Afghanistan as a kind of a crucible for terrorism. Because why did the US go into Afghanistan in the first place? We have had experience of Pakistan using the territory of Afghanistan as training camps for jihadis whom they would send into Kashmir and other parts of India, thereby not being directly exposed. So there is, in terms of the challenge of terrorism, there is no doubt that there is a convergence of interest. Not only is there cross-border terrorism against India emanating from Pakistan, but there is also cross-border terrorism against Afghanistan. And more importantly, US forces deployed in Afghanistan, because those US forces are also being killed by the same jihadis. So India and the US do not have a difference of opinion in terms of the importance of ensuring that there is a politically stable and an economically, if not prosperous, at least a economy which is has been able to at least deal with some of the aspects of very, very, very acute poverty. And India itself, as you know, has been very much engaged in having a very strong economic cooperation relationship. We have helped Afghanistan opening hospitals, schools, women's education. We have been sending medical teams to Afghanistan. Today, India is the most popular country in Afghanistan. If there is a difference of opinion between India and the US, it is with relation to Pakistan's role. Now we look at Pakistan's role as a negative role in Afghanistan. We say that the Afghanistan problem is there not because of Afghanistan, it's a problem because of Pakistan. The United States of America generally accepts that argument, but at the same time is tempted by the argument that in order to enable the United States to withdraw with some honor from Afghanistan, a political settlement can only be possible with the participation of Pakistan. And therefore it is willing to make some concessions to Pakistan. Whether it is in terms of, arms supplies to Pakistan, but for us, the more dangerous thing is when the United States of America starts accepting the Pakistani argument that if you want cooperation with us, you must pressure India to give us something on Kashmir. And for the United States, sometimes that becomes a tempting argument. So we have seen this, back and forth over a period of time. But let me say that on balance today, perhaps the US probably does not have those illusions about Pakistan's being able to play a constructive role. So overall there is a general understanding, good understanding between the two countries. Now, what happens in Afghanistan will to a very large extent depend upon the situation within Afghanistan itself developing, because as you know, there are ethnic contradictions there. You have Pashtuns and you have other ethnic groups. Our relations, of course, with all of them is very good, but we are hampered by the fact that we do not have direct access to Afghanistan. The easiest access to Afghanistan from India is through Pakistan. So much of what we have to give to Afghanistan has to be taken through a very long route. So we are constrained by that. But I would say that by and large, if one is looking at it in terms of whether India and the US are working at cross purposes in Afghanistan, I would say not really, but there are nuances where there is perhaps some difference of opinion. And as far as Japan is concerned, one of the great success stories, I think, in India's foreign policy is precisely the kind of relationship that has developed between India and Japan. I served in Japan in 1986 to 89. Let me say very, very honestly that India was not on the radar screen at all as far as Japan was concerned. It was China, China and only China. The only relationship with India was essentially the ODA relationship. We were recipient of Japanese overseas development assistance, and everything else was not important. If you compare the situation today with those years, there is a dramatic change. The relationship between the two countries has become much closer. You have heard that there is a 2+2 meeting taking place in Delhi. Defense minister and external affairs ministers of both countries are meeting together. So the relationship has been put on a very high level. There are annual summits between the leaders of the two countries. There is a very strong personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and the Japanese Prime Minister. For the first time, we actually have a defense relationship with Japan. Japan didn't want to have anything to do with defense as far as India is concerned. But today, Japan is one of our very close defense partners. And on the economic side too, while I think the promise of India-Japan economic relations, trade relations has not really been realized, but even there, I think there is a very important, development which is taking place. It is we who have not been able to fully take advantage of Japan as a very major source of capital and high technology. For that, you need to be able to create an economic environment or an investment environment in India, which is able to attract Japanese investors. You cannot say, oh, we are a very big market, you have to come only on our terms. No, there are many competing destinations for Japanese investment, even if the Chinese, relationship is going sour, but, it's not that India is the only alternative available. So if we have not been able to fully utilize the relationship to really also give a spur to our own development. The fault really is mainly our own. We have to recognize that. And so in that context, when we are talking about something like the Quad, that is, there is no doubt that there is a very strong convergence of interest among US, Japan, Australia, and perhaps in the future South Korea as well as ASEAN, precisely because of the fear everybody has of a growing China, of a dominating China. So that foundation for the Quad is very much there. But that will continue to be somewhat weak if the economic pillar is not strong. And the economic pillar today is not as strong as it should be. And lastly, with respect to India, Myanmar, Myanmar is a very important country for India because if you look at the map, the four of your most sensitive northeastern states, starting from Arunachal in the north, down to Mizoram in the south, it's about a 1,400 kilometer long border. And it is, as you know, a border which is security-wise very challenging because we have faced insurgency in the past, we have had secessionist movements here. So cooperation of Myanmar is very crucial in your ability to deal with these security challenges because, as you know, many of these groups are able to find sanctuary on the other side of the border. The good news has been that as a result of our investing in the relationship with Myanmar, both political relations, helping them on their defense side, on the trade side, Myanmar has been perhaps one of the most cooperative neighbors in helping India deal with this situation. So that is one very important reason why the relationship is important. The second is that if you're looking at a India-Southeast Asia relationship, the gateway to Southeast Asia is really Myanmar. So the stronger the relationship that you develop with Myanmar, you spoke about the trilateral highway, for example, it is important precisely because it would be a gateway to Southeast Asia, which is the reason why Myanmar is also a very crucial component of BIMSTEC, which is really a kind of a organization of both Southeast Asian as well as South Asian countries. Since SAARC is not going anywhere, so BIMSTEC is perhaps a more credible alternative. So Myanmar, there is no doubt that it's a very key. Now, the problem is that, the kind of resources that China is able to bring to its relationship with countries in our neighborhood, not just Myanmar, but if you're looking at, say, Nepal, or you look at the CPEC in Pakistan, or what we have seen happen in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, our biggest constraint is that even if we are very keen to establish very close relations with these neighbors, we simply do not have the scale of resources that the Chinese are able to bring. If China is able to throw $1 billion here, $1 billion there, we don't have that. So that itself becomes a major constraint, and that is apparent also in our relationship with Myanmar. So when you are faced with an asymmetrical situation like this, then you start looking at what are some of the asymmetrical assets that you have. So when we are talking about, for example, countries like Nepal or Bhutan or even Sri Lanka, one of the very important assets that we have is proximity. Are you ready to open up your borders to your neighbors? How good is the connectivity that you can establish with your neighboring countries? And this includes Myanmar. India, in the Indian subcontinent today, is not even as connected as it was in 1947, before partition. That's the reality. So we have not been able to resume, the linkages across the border, whether it is rail linkages or road linkages, even telephones. You can't call directly to Pakistan, for example. The gateway is through some other country. Much of the trade with Pakistan, which should be right across the border, I think the last calculation was that the trade between India and Pakistan is worth about $12 billion, real trade. But only 2 billion or 3 billion actually crosses the borders. Most of it is either through Dubai or through Singapore. Now that makes no sense. Why let a third country profit from it when you can actually do the transactions right across the border? But connectivity is an issue. So going forward, if you really want to deal with this Chinese challenge, you have to, like a businessman, say, okay, what are my assets? What are my liabilities? It makes no sense for you to keep running after what China. Oh, China has built an airport here. Let's also go and build an airport there. No, that's a mug's game. What you need to do is to decide, okay, which are my areas of strength? What are my assets and how do I leverage those? How do I try to overcome some of the vulnerabilities that I have? Neutralize them. So that requires a very different way of looking at your neighborhood, and that of course includes Myanmar as well.
Thank you, sir. So ma'am would probably have a few questions
I have
for you.
2-3 questions. First of all, sir, I would like that you throw some light on how India should balance US and Iran triangle. That can be one thing. And the second thing I want to know, what are the current geopolitical interests of USA in Afghanistan at present? What I feel that much of US foreign policy is in context of rising China and containment of China. So in this context, I feel that cooperation in the field of terrorism, maybe US has an interest in continuation of the instability in Afghanistan, and maybe they want withdrawal of the forces primarily for domestic reasons. So I don't see that US is really interested that terrorism threat should, this terrorism challenge in Afghanistan, this itself can be a objective of their foreign policy. This is I don't see any strong reason for USA's interest, because in the past USA has been interested in entering into some sort of agreement with Taliban. So can you just throw this lot of confusion in US policy in Afghanistan, one, and second, even in Middle East. And we have a history of trust deficit between India and USA. And what is the status of that level of trust, especially when Trump policies create a lot of unpredictability? There's a lot of talk that his approach is more transactional in nature. So in short, I feel I don't see much scope of cooperation between India and USA in the western part, the way it is there in the east, and how far US is a reliable partner, because Henry Kissinger himself said that it is dangerous to be USA's enemy, and it is fatal to be their friend. So, do you really see emerging scope of strategic partnership? Because US-China economic relationships is also very, economic interdependence is also very high. And within USA, there is a big section which do still talk about G2. And I feel US as well as China's current relationship create a lot of challenges, how India should be dealing with. So, sir, can you please throw some light on current strategic objectives of US in Afghanistan? I don't feel like they are really interested in stability there. The second thing is how India should manage its relations with Iran vis-a-vis USA, and level of trust we really have with USA.
This may sound a bit odd, but in foreign policy, we don't look for things like trust, friendship. I mean, these are packaging. If I have a good relationship, I say I have a relationship of trust with you. If I have a good relationship, I say we are very good friends. So if you look at even recent history, those who have been friends today are enemies. Those who have had a very strong element of trust today have no trust at all. So I don't think we should frame the issue or the relationships in terms of whether there is trust or not. I think what we need to look at is there a certain convergence of interest, which whether you are a friend or you are not a friend brings us together to pursue a certain common objective. That is what is important. So we look at interests. We don't look at is this country going to be friendly with us, or is this country, am I able to have more trust with this country? No, we don't look at that. We look at what convergence of interest, or if there is a divergence of interest, as I mentioned to you, that India and the United States have been two very vibrant democracies. But that did not help us in terms of overcoming what were very real differences in terms of our interests. So in the context of Washington, during the Cold War, I may say, oh, bad fellows, they are not friendly. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the United States, which had defined its interests as opposing the Soviet Union, trying to defeat the Soviet Union, India did not figure too well in that calculation. So it was not that they didn't see us as a friend, or they did not have a trust, or we did not have a trust. That is not the case. So I think we have to be clear in how you look at these kind of relationship. Now, your question with regard to Iran. There is no doubt that Iran is a key country for us. Not only because of historical reasons, cultural reasons, but if you are looking at India's energy security, Iran is a very important source of energy supplies. I mentioned to you that we do not have direct access to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, because of Pakistan being in between. Iran is probably one of the only countries which can give us, relatively speaking, easier access to Afghanistan, easier access to Central Asia. So, the talk about the Chabahar port, or, the northern axis that we are working together with Iran on. This will give us another access to Central Asia. So for that reason also it is very important. Third is the sectarian issue, that Iran is, after all, the key Shia country. For us, we also have a Shia population. Second largest Shia population in the world is in India. So whatever happens on the sectarian side in the Gulf also then sometimes has a blowback effect here. Now you look at the Babri Masjid thing. If the Sunnis are saying we do not want the 5 acres, the Shia are saying we will take the 5 acres. So this is, it's something new that we are seeing. We have not had in the past this kind of tension between Sunnis and Shias in India. For that matter, that it wasn't there in the Gulf either. It has been, in a sense, instigated. But Iran's, therefore, for those reasons, is very important for us. But there is the reality of not so much the US trying to pressurize us, but 2 or 3 important things. One is that the world's payment systems are essentially dollar denominated. Much of international banking, for example, if I'm doing dollar payments, it goes through some US bank, through some US bank. So our ability to continue with normal trading across the world, we find it constrained if we resist the United States sanctions against Iran. Because any Indian company which may defy those sanctions and still do business with Iran, then gets locked out of the international payment system. Now, that may be a very bad thing that it is dominated by the US, but that is the reality. You have seen what happened with the Europeans, because the Europeans said, well, if the US wants to walk out of the Iran nuclear deal, we will continue to observe that deal, and we will try to find some alternative ways of minimizing the impact of US sanctions on Iran. They were not able to, because all their companies are also dealing with the United States. So there is that reality, which becomes a constraint on us. We may not like it, but it is a constraint on us. The other aspect is that today not only is the US opposed to Iran, but there is also, as I said, a Shia-Sunni conflict, but also a regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are the two key players in the region. And if we get caught in between, then that can also be a problem for us. Today, if we are not able to get the oil from Iran because of the payment problem, we at least have as an alternative in other Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia. And I think one of the things that I would compliment this government on is that they have somehow or the other tried to walk a fine line by keeping the relationship with Iran in reasonable order, not as much as Iran would like, but at the same time ensuring that our interests in terms of getting energy supplies from other major players is not compromised. But because we are seen as being on the other side. Also, I think we have to recognize, and which brings me to your second point, that as far as the United States is concerned, there is a very major change in terms of US calculations with regard to the Middle East, and which is that US is no longer dependent upon energy supplies from the Middle East. US is today an exporter of oil, US is today an exporter of natural gas. So that same kind of, very strong interest in what is happening in the Middle East is not that important. What is important still is Israel, because of the, partly domestic reasons, but partly historical reasons. Maintaining the security of Israel is a very key element of US foreign policy. So what they are trying to do in the Middle East is to see that there is a certain balance which is maintained, which ensures that Israel remains a viable and secure state. What is worrying for us is that the US seems to have ceded space to China as far as Central Asia is concerned. So what you mentioned about there being a certain difference in the way the US is looking at the eastern flank and the way it is looking at the western flank, there is a difference. And this is a point of contention between us and the US. Because what we tell the US is that for any decision maker sitting in Delhi, if we are looking at a China challenge, it is not that China is a challenge only in the East. It is perhaps an even bigger challenge for us in the West. See, the China-Pakistan axis, you see, it is not operating in the South China Sea. It is operating here, next door. So you cannot expect us to cooperate with you in the East and say, well, on the western flank, maybe it's not so important. It is important for us. We believe that it should be important to the US as well. Because what is happening today is that the whole Eurasian corridor, that is between western part of China and Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, essentially it is a completely open door for China. Because the only other power which had very major influence there has been Russia. Now, because of Western pressure on Russia, especially after what happened in Ukraine, the Russians have had no option but to go closer to the Chinese, not because they like to be closer to the Chinese. In fact, there is considerable suspicion between the two sides. So there's no trust there, there is no friendship there. But it is something which is dictated by the kind of geopolitical situation that they are facing. So this is another argument that we have with the US. We say if you regard China as your main adversary, and that it is going to become an even bigger adversary in the future, then actually you should have stronger relationship with Russia. Because the Russians don't want to be under Chinese domination. So there are these, I agree with you that there are these kind of, somewhat peculiar kind of thinking that you see, not so much in the strategic community in the US, because I think they do see the logic of this, but it does not seem to be reflected in actual US foreign policy. When Trump actually became the president, the first conversations that we had with the incoming team in Washington, we were actually very happy because they said, we agree with you. We need to have better relations with Russia. And in fact, if you remember, Trump did try to resume better relations with Russia, but there was a very strong pushback by the Washington elite in a sense, which is almost congenitally anti-Russian. So this has it's an angularity in India, in US policy that we are not able to do very much about, except keep the conversation going. So is the US interested in instability in Afghanistan? I would say no, that is not the objective. I think the objective still is twofold. One is, can we ensure that Afghanistan, as I said, does not become once again a kind of a base for terror against the United States? And the second is, having had to fight perhaps the longest war in US history, almost nearly 20 years now, how do we get out? Because as you said, there is no domestic support for it anymore. But you don't want to get out being seen as a defeated party. That is not compatible with US sense of itself. So in that context, there may be some contradictions. So talking to the Taliban, we think it is not a good thing to talk to the Taliban, because they are also, in strict terms, they are also terrorists. But in terms of how the US is looking at its interests, dominating interests of actually withdrawing from Afghanistan, okay. Sometimes you see these very contradictory things happening, because when states are under pressure, they try various things. I mean, you see arguments in India also, why should you not talk to Taliban? That you should also be talking to Taliban. So, I mean, those elements will always be there. But by and large, I would say that the intent of US policy in Afghanistan is not that there is some diabolical kind of motivation to keep the place in turmoil, and that should be seen as an interest of the United States. That, I would say, is certainly the interest of Pakistan, but I do not see that as the interest of the United States.
Take one more question, or okay, so the last question is actually related partly to your book. Of all the recent books I've read from former ambassadors, your book specifically does bring focus on the climate change aspect, something that I am of the opinion that may play an important role in Indian foreign policy as well. So looking at wherever the climate change related issues or negotiations are going, do you see that climate change will pose certain new challenges or opportunities for India in the foreign policy, particularly with respect to South Asia, in terms of refugee crisis, or in terms of, is India really looking to deal with possible challenges thrown by climate change, especially with respect to its neighborhood?
No, that's a simple answer. But that's not only India. I mean, I believe that there is a certain collective blindness all across the world. This is an existential crisis. This is a crisis which is really involves the survival of the human race. Not just the human race, in fact, the planet. I think we are reaching a threshold where if we cross that threshold, there will be changes in the planetary ecology which will be permanent, you know, and life as we know it may no longer exist. It is not also something which is going to happen in the future. It is happening now itself. It has started happening now itself. So I think the first order of business is, do we recognize how urgent and how a comprehensive a challenge this is? Because only after you recognize that, can there be any question of playing any role? You know? Now, if you are looking at, can India play such a role? I would say yes, of course. Because, you know, if you look at Indian tradition, if you look at Indian culture, you know, it has a very different view of nature. For the West, Industrial Revolution was all about how do I conquer nature? How do I harness nature to, you know, human need and human better life for human beings. So, in a sense, you separated humanity from nature. In fact, that is the logic of the Industrial Revolution. In Indian tradition, nature has been looked upon as a mother, as a source of nurture. You must not take away from nature what nature is not able to regenerate again. So if you're looking at any, source of sustainable philosophy, it is there in all your Indian texts, it is there. It is because you have moved away from that, that you are facing the kind of problems you have. So can we go back to that sense of looking at nature as something that is not apart from us, is part of us? You know, that's a change in system of values that you need. It is not something that you can tinker with in terms of the whole strategy of economic development that you have has to change. If you can't do that, if your aspiration is still what the standard of living is, for example, in the United States of America, if you are aspiring to ways of living that you have seen in the West, I'm afraid that is not possible. If you just take, for example, car ownership, even with 18 to 20 cars per 1,000 of population, look at the transport, challenge that you face. In Europe, you have 600 to 700 cars per 1,000 population. In the United States, it's almost 1 car per population. It's about 800 to 900 per 1,000. Even a fraction of that, if you are aspiring to, not all the oil in the world, not all the, even if you have electric cars, not all the power in the world, not all the, where is the parking place? Where are you going to drive those cars? Okay.
Sure, sir.
So we cannot aspire to that. So you have to accept that you need to have a strategy of development which says, we will keep taxing private transportation more and more and invest money in cost-effective, affordable, efficient public transportation. That is the future. But that's not the future that we are looking at. Yeah. So first, as I said, first of order of business is first to recognize that we are facing a challenge. And this is an urgent. Once you do that, everything else may follow into place. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to leave, but it has been a great pleasure, interacting with you.
Thank you, sir.
Let me end by also wishing you all the very best in your civil service exams.
Yes. Just a second. We'll just request you all to wait. Let Sir leave first and then probably just hold on for 2 more minutes. Because time is more precious. Thank you, sir.